On the night of July 13th, 1977, New York City went dark. Not just a few blocks losing power, but the entire city. Across the 5 boroughs, the lights went out and the city vanished into total blackness. The power grid collapsed like a house of cards, and what began as a technical failure quickly turned into one of the most chaotic nights in the city's history. By morning, over 1,600 stores had been looted, more than 1,000 fires set, and 3,700 people arrested. It was a moment when a city already on the edge finally lost its grip. And for a few haunting hours, the world's greatest metropolis revealed how fragile civilization could be when the lights went out. The story begins with the New York of the late 1970s. It wasn't the polished metro of today, it was a city in freefall. Crime was at record highs, unemployment was climbing, and the city government was nearly bankrupt. Entire neighborhoods had fallen into disrepair. Landlords torched their own buildings for insurance money, and the police department was stretched to the breaking point. The blackout didn't create the chaos, it merely exposed it. Earlier that summer, the city had been baking under a brutal heat wave. Tempers were short, air conditioners were running nonstop, and the electrical grid was straining. Meanwhile, the son of Sam serial killer was stalking young couples across the boroughs. Fear and frustration were already in the air. At 8:37 p.m., a bolt of lightning hit a high-voltage transmission line north of the city. Normally, the grid could reroute power, but this time, through a mix of bad luck, human error, and system overload, one failure triggered another. Within minutes, the entire Con Edison network collapsed. Manhattan blinked off first, followed by the Bronx, Queens, and Brooklyn. Finally, Staten Island was the last to go. By 9:40 p.m., every borough was shut down. For a moment, the bridges glowed faintly in the distance, but then they went dark. And beneath the streets, the subways screeched to a halt, leaving thousands stranded in pitch-black tunnels. From space, astronauts reported seeing the eastern seaboard lit up, except for a single, ominous void where New York should have been. At first, many New Yorkers did what people always do during blackouts. They went outside. Some laughed, some sang, some lit candles in their windows. But as the hours passed, the mood shifted. Without lights, without police radios, without the unblinking eyes of the city that never sleeps, something else began to stir. In the Bronx and Brooklyn, it started small. A few kids broke into an electronics store, but others followed. When the police failed to respond, the word spread. The city's dark and nobody's watching. Soon, entire blocks were alive with the sounds of breaking glass and sirens. Storefronts were ripped open, televisions and stereos carried off by the armload. Some people came with shopping carts, others with cars. By midnight, the looting was widespread. In Bushwick, an already struggling neighborhood, more than 1,000 businesses were vandalized or burned. Firefighters couldn't reach many of the blazes. Their trucks were blocked by mobs or disabled when rioters slashed their tires. Local news stations were off the air. Police dispatchers were overwhelmed, and what footage exists from that night, grainy, handheld shots from local crews, feels like something out of a war zone. Silhouettes darting through smoke, flashes of fire reflected in puddles, streets littered with shattered glass. It's important to remember not all New Yorkers descended into chaos. In Manhattan's Upper East Side, people gathered on rooftops and drank wine by candlelight. In some neighborhoods, residents patrolled their own blocks to keep looters out. But in others, particularly in communities that had been neglected and over-policed for years, the blackout felt like an explosion of pent-up anger. Sociologists later described it as a release of desperation. For many poor residents, those stores weren't just symbols of capitalism, they were places that had long excluded them. Expensive goods they could never afford suddenly became within reach, if only for one night. Still, when the sun rose, the scale of destruction was undeniable. By dawn, more than 3,700 arrests had been made. Over 1,500 fires had been reported, with entire blocks of the Bushwick neighborhood reduced to ashes. In the Bronx, firefighters collapsed from exhaustion. Store owners stood in front of gutted shops, sweeping glass with their bare hands. The total damage was estimated at over $300 million, a staggering sum for a city already teetering on bankruptcy. Mayor Abraham Beame called it a night of terror. He toured the wreckage that morning, flanked by police, and he was visibly shaken. Power came back to most of the city by the next evening. Subways ran again, lights flickered on in Times Square, but the trust between communities and city leadership didn't recover so quickly. For months afterward, Politicians blamed lawless youth while residents blamed systemic neglect. The police department increased patrols, but many neighborhoods felt abandoned in the aftermath. Still, out of the ruins, there was also resilience. Community leaders in Bushwick organized rebuilding programs, and some residents turned looting lots into gardens. Artists and filmmakers also began documenting the decay, whose work would come to shape the unmistakable grit of 1980s New York. By the early 1980s, New York began to change. Federal aid trickled in, new policing strategies took hold, and the economic tide slowly turned. But the memory of 1977 lingered, a symbol of just how close the city had come to implosion. In retrospect, the blackout wasn't just about the power grid, it was about a city stretched past its limits. Years of corruption, economic inequality, and neglect had created a pressure cooker, and when the electricity failed, the lid blew off. For 25 hours, the city's divisions were laid bare. Rich and poor, downtown and uptown, light and dark. Decades later, people still talk about where they were that night. Some remember candlelit dinners and laughter in the dark. Others remember flames and smoke rising from rooftops. For historians, the 1977 blackout stands as a snapshot of a turning point, the end of one New York and the messy beginning of another. That night revealed what every city dweller secretly fears, that the systems holding society together are far more fragile than we want to believe. A few lightning bolts hundreds of miles away, a few overloaded circuits, and civilization can collapse into something primitive and unpredictable. Thank you everybody for watching the video. If you enjoyed this content, please consider subscribing to the channel. I'd really appreciate the support.